Hello, History 20 students. Apologize, I'm just a little bit late today. My first session ran a little bit over, but it was a good discussion. I just didn't want to end it, so I apologize. Getting a couple minutes late here. We're getting near the end of the semester, so just some general housekeeping items. People have been handing in assignments. I've been assessing them. I've been giving feedback. I intended to get a report card out earlier this week, but there were some assignments that came in that I wanted to mark, so I'm hoping to get those out tomorrow. It'll probably be the last progress report that you and your parents or guardians receive, and then after that, it's hopefully just kind of a race to the finish line and make sure that you end up with meeting the educational goals or the learning goals that you had for this class, or a mark goal, or whatever it is that you had. I want to encourage you again, as I always do, if you feel like you're struggling with anything, any of the course materials or assignments or anything, please do let me know, and I'd be happy to help you out with it. Students, several have been sort of in close contact with me via email for the entire semester, and I think they've appreciated the assistance, and at least they've told me they have, and the assignments tend to be very, very good. And I'm here to support you. We've got about 2.5 weeks left, and we're on the home stretch. And I know this first quarter is often difficult. It's often difficult to get your feet back under you and plan things and schedule things. And I know I'm the same as everybody. No matter how well you plan, at the end of a quarter, things tend to pile up a little bit, and you just got to do the best you can to put the time in and do what you need to do to demonstrate your learning to the best of your ability, and I will help support you in that. One thing that I mentioned to the History 10 students when I was talking to them today is when you're going through each unit, it's never a bad idea to look at the assessments first. So to look at the assignments and don't do them, but just look at them and make yourself little mental notes or even a couple jot notes on paper, so that when you go back and you watch the videos or you read through the learning materials or the presentations or whatnot, you've kind of got an idea in your head about what you're looking for. It just makes you a little, it makes you a little more focused, a little bit more targeted, and it helps you improve your ability to look at a larger piece or group of information and sort of pull from it the important things, because not everything you see and hear or read is going to be, all that important in the grand scheme of things. It's a good idea to try to parse out the information and focus on the things that either are important to the course or the curriculum or important to you personally. And it'll just keep you more focused, it'll keep you more targeted, and hopefully a little bit more interested. So that's a recommendation that I gave them, and I'll give you as well. With regard to the assignments, we've done several kind of essay type assignments, and I noticed that the formatting and the level of detail given in the paragraphs as we move forward, the idea of a good introduction with a thesis, body paragraphs that one paragraph per main point that you make in your introduction, and then maybe a paragraph saying why these other arguments aren't so valid, and then a good concluding. I noticed that those are improving significantly, and that's a great skill. That's a skill that you need to have, not just in high school, but moving forward, is the ability to write effectively, clearly, to clearly communicate your point via the written medium, because you're going to need that in whatever your goals are after school, whether it's moving into a career or going into advanced education, post-secondary education, things like that. It's a very, very important skill set. So that's sort of general thinking. We are, by our course calendar, past the Cold War era into the era of protests, and I'm going to try to move a little quicker today. So I apologize if the points are made, maybe a little quicker than I normally make them, although I do tend to elaborate a little too much anyway. So hopefully you find this somewhat useful. I'm just going to kind of look at, go through the learning materials and just kind of highlight some of the things, and maybe give a slightly different overview than what you might have seen in the learning materials, the videos, etc. And some of this is based on my own research, some of this is based on my own personal experience, some of this is based on just me being a 43-year-old man who's been exposed to more life experience, history, that sort of thing, media, whatnot, than you will have at your age. And that's not a knock on you. It's just you haven't had as much time as I have to sort of absorb and process all of this stuff. So I'm going to try to go through both the Unit 2 stuff as well start into the sort of social movements and progress in Unit 3. So we're past World War II. We've discussed the end of World War II and whatnot. Once again, Germany made poor decisions, tried to start two-front war when they essentially had what was a truce with Russia, but they felt they could do it. And once again, the winters of Russia, and as well as the massive number of people, the massive population of their army, ultimately led to the downfall of the axis of evil, or however you want to term it, Germany, Italy, and Japan to some extent, and the Japan getting the U.S. into the war, and the combination of the D-Day attacks on the west side of Europe, as well as Russia taking ground back on the east side after a horrible winter where the German troops were just annihilated by starvation and lack of resources, led to the powers losing that war. Mussolini was executed. Hitler killed himself. General Toro, I believe, not Toro. I'm forgetting the name, but the general commander of the military in Japan, I believe, was executed as well. And then there were Nuremberg trials for the high-ranking German officials who supported and planned and executed the Holocaust. And so it's the end of the war. What happens? Well, essentially everybody goes home. Germany has to rebuild again. Russia is in a state of there was a lot of problems with farming at the time, just with bad winter and poor levels of certainly of agricultural technology as compared to the rest of Europe and whatnot. They weren't in revolution, but they were making transitions and had been making transitions under Stalin into a fully, started with Lenin, but moving into Stalin. Fully communist society. Technically, the government and the people are the government. The government owns everything, and every worker is sort of subject to the same expectations for work and the same support levels. It didn't work out that way. It never does, because people in power tend to take more power and wealth for themselves. But they were going down the road of a very, very strong communist approach, a very, very strong socialist, but actually communist approach in Russia. And dissenters, anybody who disagreed with the boss, was essentially executed or sent to Siberia, which is the northern part of Russia, where there were prisons and forced labor camps, and all, like millions and millions of people, of their own people, were killed on purpose for basically not supporting the government or communists or pushing ideals that weren't accepted. So that's what's going on in Russia. France, Italy, Germany essentially all have to rebuild again because they just had another massive war. Britain, same thing. Britain largely unscathed in World War I because they were across the channel, and modern warfare hadn't really advanced to the point where there were bombers and planes and things like that could attack to do any great damage to Britain. But now in World War II, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had bombing raids on London for a long time, and essentially turned large portions of that city into rubble. So Britain is part of the rebuild now as well. Overseas, America relatively untouched, except for the Pearl Harbor incident, which drew them into the war in the first place. So there wasn't a whole lot of sort of physical infrastructure being rebuilt in either Canada or U.S. at the time. We were part of the war; they were part of the war. A big reason why the tides turned against the Germans and Germans, Italians, the Allies. And but that being said, there wasn't a whole lot of destruction on our end. Most of the casualties we had were troops that we had sent overseas. So we didn't have the same sort of rebuilding efforts. And what that led to is a very, very significant social shift, particularly in North America, something referred to as the baby boom. And my grandparents were a part of the baby boom. My grandfather would have been 98 years old this year. He's no longer with us, but he would have been about 98. He was a soldier in the Second World War. He went overseas. He fought in France and Italy and up into the Netherlands, I believe. And he was part of the group of soldiers, those who were lucky enough to come home, that were part of the baby boom era. Population had been increasing at the time, and we're going to talk about North America a bit here. Population had been increasing prior to the war, but when the war starts, all the efforts of the country tend to go towards the war. So, men and those capable of fighting, and there were women, certainly women who were sent overseas as well, but the vast majority were of soldiers were men. Were working overseas. A lot of the people that were home, a lot of women that had been in sort of more domestic, it was just the times. I'm not saying this is right, but at the times, more domestic sort of roles, taking care of house, taking care of children, that sort of thing. Were kind of thrust. A lot of them were thrust into working at factories and things that produce things for the war. We need vehicles for war, we need planes for war, we need ammunition for war. So it puts your economy into a very, very healthy incline, because you're paying people to work. So when you're paying people to work, there's more money, people spend more money and whatnot, but at the same time, there's a war going on. So when the war's over, those who are lucky enough to come back are coming back to a pretty good economic situation. And the general sort of financial situation for people in general was improved significantly as compared to before the war. There were a lot of supports in place in both Canada and the US for veterans who were returning from the war to be able to purchase a house. So there was a lot of movement from farms into cities. So they were able to purchase a house with a very, very low interest rate. And there was often money left over, and the manufacturing had been set up prior to the war, but really ramped up during the war. So people were able to get cars at reasonable prices and appliances for the kitchen, and sort of what we think of as sort of a more suburban living. Like entire sections of land were set aside for veterans housing. So in Saskatoon, for instance, the area of Montgomery, where my dad actually grew up, it was mostly the houses all looked the same. They had nice big lots. The houses were small, but they were affordable. Most of the people coming back from the war, kind of no matter what kind of job they had when they came back from the war, most of them were able to afford a house and to move out to this area. And again, the houses were cheap, and the interest rates, the loans that they got from the houses, the government had supported programs to make it so that they could afford these things, and they could afford, generally cars. I mean, the money was still tight. I have lots and lots of stories from my dad and my grandfather growing up and whatnot. And money was always tight, but they always had the things that they need. They had a house, they had a car. The kids had school. My grandmother worked part-time, but she was mostly at home raising the kids and taking care of the household and whatnot. But this would be the experience of a lot of veterans coming back from war. And these entire areas of cities, which kind of became known as the suburbs, were set up and were largely populated by veterans. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen inside the cities as well, but I'm just thinking of in Saskatoon, of Montgomery in particular, as an area that was almost entirely veterans housing. So people come back from war. It's happening in the United States and in Canada, and they've generally got sort of a more stable financial basis, and their physiological needs are being met, and so they have more kids. They're more comfortable. Family sizes are getting larger. The number of average births per family is going up. And what happened is between the period of, say, 1945 and 1958, give or take, the population boomed significantly, and that's what was referred to as the baby boom. There were a lot of babies, and the boom being the sort of explosion in the number of children that veterans were having in their families when they came home. So there's a very large group of people now, my father's age, somewhere in the range of like 65 and 75, who would be part of that baby boom generation, where there's like significantly more of them than there are of Gen Xers or Gen Ys or millennial babies. And that's been an interesting time socially and economically and politically, as that group of people has moved through their teen years to their 20s to their 30s, because there's so many of them. They tended to kind of society kind of revolved around them, for lack of better words. People in my father's generation, things like Wall Street and the idea of stock portfolios and corporate ownership and big business was something that really exploded with that generation, and control of politics and support for certain parties and whatnot kind of tended to flow with that baby boom era. So this is my grandparents, which would mean that this would be at sort of at minimum your great grandparents. You may have a grandparent who might have fit into this group, but likely your great grandparents were more in that group. So I had a really interesting window into the raising of and sort of life of both parents in the baby boom era, my grandparents, as well as children in the baby boom era, my parents. And it was definitely an interesting time. So, generally speaking, finances are pretty good in North America when the veterans come back. Population boom increases. Anti-war sentiment is huge right now. Okay, we've just been through 2 world wars in the last, what would it be, 30 years or less? And at the end of each war, yes, goals were accomplished, but too many people died. Too many good people were sacrificed to these causes. And at the end of the day, I think you'd have to be a little insane to say that we should be continuing to fight huge, large-scale wars where millions of people die. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a very something that a good citizen would think or believe. In any case, people are very against the war, and now something's happened where a huge focus on the destructive potential of weaponry is now at the forefront. The first nuclear weapons ever detonated over civilian or armed populations happened at the end of World War II. The US did it. The bombing of Harry S. Truman authorized the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Hundreds of thousands of people killed almost instantly. Blast radiuses of blast radii of 3 to 5 square miles of destruction and reduced to rubble, and then sort of nuclear winter and things like ash and particulate in the air and radiation killing people after the fact. Not necessarily just the bomb striking, but the health issues and deaths that happened after that, as well as the complete destruction of the cities, the complete destruction of the economic systems and the manufacturing systems and whatnot. Now, to be fair, Japan did a wonderful job of rebuilding that nation post World War II. For such a small nation, the impact that Japan has had economically and politically in the world since World War II has been quite stunning. I mean, they were the strongest economy in the world for most of the 80s and 90s, and to this day are a huge economy and manufacturer and very strong, given it's such a sort of small island with a relatively small population. When you look at India and China and whatnot. Now, obviously, China is having a huge impact on all global markets and has been for the last 20 years. But the period after World War II, Japan and Germany both rebuilt their economies and really became world leaders. But that was sort of beside my point. Things were pretty good in the U.S. and Canada. People had what they needed. Not everybody, but in general terms. Populations were rising, the economy was very strong, and there was a huge anti-war sentiment kind of brewing with common people because they were the first generation that was basically witness to the idea that, wow, the world could end tomorrow. We now have the type of destructive capability in nuclear weapons that it's no longer just a case of sending soldiers against soldiers and tanks against tanks and planes against planes. Now we've come to the point where the potential to drop a nuclear weapon on a major city and kill millions of people is very real. So every nation, of course, panics. The U.S. Has a bit of a head start because they were the ones that, through the Manhattan Project, which I actually recommend reading a little about. It's very interesting, both the science and the politics behind it. The Americans in the Manhattan Project, lots and lots of brilliant minds working to make a destructive weapon. Most of the people who were in the groups that actually ended up designing it later, I think quite regretted that this is one of those things they kind of wish they could uninvent. So the U.S. has a heads up on nuclear armed development. However, there were traitors, there were people who had sold secrets, who were on the inner workings of the Manhattan Project, who had sold secrets to the Russians. So the Russians, they weren't that far behind. Basically, everybody who had the potential to start developing nuclear weapons did. And the huge world powers at the time were Russia and the US. Those were the two huge military powers. There was a lot of rebuilding going on in Western Europe, so they were kind of out for now. But there was definitely those two were the big ones. And it was two huge systems. It was the idea of communism in Russia, and it was the idea of democracy and freedom in North America and the US. And these two parties were way far apart on the political spectrum. And it caused a lot of worry because both nations had access to nuclear weapons that could essentially, be a world ender. So it's a kind of a scary time in American history. And if you know somebody who lived through that period, like my father, my grandfather, these were very legitimate concerns. People were building bomb shelters and stocking them with purified water and canned goods and things like that, just in case somebody bombed a city. Things that nobody had ever worried about before. If you were fighting a world war in 1939 or 1940 overseas, it's horrible, and we're sending troops and whatnot. But if you're living in Saskatoon at the time, you're not really all that concerned that the German, Russian soldiers, whoever, German, Italian soldiers are going to come knocking on your door and take the fight to North America. You weren't concerned about that. But now that superpowers, communist superpowers in Europe and Asia had these weapons, now there's actually a concern that, oh man, they might not bring troops over, but a nuclear weapon could make it to Saskatoon or New York or Miami or whatever. And that's a concern that people in North America had never had to think about before. People in Europe had been thinking about it because they'd been having basically nonstop conflict for hundreds of years, but it was a relatively new phenomenon in North America. So there's a real fear of what's happening. The pride of being, particularly in the States, the pride of being the nation that developed the nuclear bomb and essentially ended the war with the nuclear bomb. That pride, it led to jubilation and excitement that the war was over and that we won and blah, 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 blah. But after that kind of went away, people really started thinking about, oh man, well, it happened to Japan. It could happen to us. And that jubilation, excitement sort of got replaced by fear that this could happen here. It's never, unless it affects you directly, sometimes people don't really process it. So this became a real fear. And then that was sort of laying the groundwork for social movements in North America. And so the stop the bomb and anti-war sentiments were coming from the generation that were kids when World War II was fighting. So this would be my father's generation. Again, my dad was born in 52. So, as he is going into the 1960s and 1970s, this sort of anti-war sentiment was rolling on. At a political level, there was a real worry at globally, again, two superpowers, US, Russia, essentially. There were others that had nuclear weapons and had strong economies, but they were definitely the two biggest. The Russians are, extending influence into Western European countries and Eastern European countries, whereby communism was taking hold in some of the places that bordered Russia. And this was a concern for the US. The US was more or less okay with Russia being communist and doing their own thing and whatnot, but they started getting concerned that if communism spread across Europe, that all of a sudden it would be an us against them kind of thing, and then it would be, there would be potential for a mass group of communist nations to do very harmful things to North America and places that had very democratic and freedom-based political systems. So there was a huge anti-communist fear in the States in the 1950s, big time. And the tough part was nobody wanted to go to war. So the U.S. didn't want to have to go to war about anything related to the communist versus democratic system, because we had enough war. Everybody's had enough war. But at the same time, they're concerned that communism is spreading to other countries. And so at this point in the U.S., I'm going to speak mostly for the U.S. perspective because, Canada, we've got different ways of thinking about things, but, a lot of times we're just kind of pulled along with the U.S. because it's so the political and economic might and whatnot. We're kind of sucked into that a bit. So I'm just mostly going to talk about the U.S. and my understanding and learnings of the U.S. at the time. Huge anti-communist sentiment. People were being, accused of being communists in the streets. If you had any ideas that were remotely socialist and not sort of a conservative bent or based on freedom and liberty and whatnot, you were branded a communist and bad things could happen to you. So this made its way all the way up through the political realm. There was a famous senator named Joe McCarthy, who was famous for basically trying to push this idea that there's communists everywhere and there's communists in government and they're secretly trying to let the Russians take over. And he did a lot of damage because he was a senator, so he was had a very influential political figure, and he actually had committees set up to try to find people, and there were big anti-communist groups in government and whatnot that were basically like spies and trying to find out who's the traitor in our midst, and let's make a list of people who we think are communists and let's put them in jail forever kind of deal. And so that was really harmful. And I'm sure of course there were people who were sympathetic to the communist cause. There were probably, it's a big government. There's probably people who were feeding Russians information and whatnot. But the level of hysteria that it came to under Joe McCarthy was kind of ridiculous, vaguely, and it raised fear in the general person. Am I going to be accused of being a communist if I say this or do this or that? And it kind of went directly against the ideas of liberty and expression, freedom of expression, and things like that. So it's a confusing time to some extent in the U.S. because on one hand, the economy is really good and people tended to be happier and whatnot. But on the other hand, now we've got fear of nuclear war. We've got McCarthyists and anti-communist groups pushing this fear on people. And it was a time where the U.S. government was so concerned about it that they pumped a whole lot of money into the CIA, which is a Central Intelligence Agency. And the documents from the CIA workings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have not been released for the most part, at least the stuff that they don't want you to see. But I think some of the stories of what the CIA was up to in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's been heavily speculated. But there's, they always say, people say where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a heck of a lot of smoke that the CIA was involved in supplying. Say if there was a conflict going on in other nations where it was sort of like they might go communist, they might be democratic, the CIA would be funneling money, guns, soldiers for training, weaponry, secretly to these militia groups to help them make sure that democracy was established in that country. And they did this all over the world. They did this in El Salvador and Guatemala. They did this in certainly in Southeast Asia. And the amount of money that would have been taken from American taxpayers to make sure that all this stuff happened was trillions and trillions of dollars at the end of the day. So the CIA behind the scenes, there's all secret spy stuff, secret espionage stuff, is propping up a lot of governments and militia and insurgents who wanted to kind of push for democracy. And in a lot of these countries, they were known as puppet regimes. Whereas, yeah, the Democratic group might have won, but now the U.S., because they helped them do it, has the puppet strings and can make these nations do whatever they want, banana republics, that sort of thing. And so the CIA was up to a lot of very, very interesting and nasty stuff during that time. Russia, same thing. They had their Politburo and KGB, lots of secret spy stuff. Britain, same thing, lots of secret spy stuff. Yeah, a lot of it's really dramatized on TV and movies, but that stuff happened. I mean, there was a huge goal for nations to get spies into other nations and to get secrets about military and about weaponry and things like that. It was huge in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the means by which these governments went about doing these things were often things that the average citizen, A, they didn't know anything about, but B, if they did know about it, they'd think, oh my God, that's horrible. Why are we doing that? I don't support that. And that's why it was done secretly. And that's why the government put so much money behind the scenes in discretionary budgets for agencies like the CIA to do the things that the government thought were important to preserving the way that Americans, Canadians, etc. live. Now, Canada, we're just not big enough, and I don't know enough about our Secret Service to know how involved we were in that, but certainly the CIA in the U.S. was very, very involved in that. So you got this really interesting political environment going on right now. It's very much an us versus them. And nations are building nuclear weapons and stockpiling nuclear weapons, and now have the ability to send nuclear weapons overseas, thousands and thousands of miles, and destroy a city on the other side of the world. So everybody's building up these repositories of nuclear weapons, and it comes with the idea of what's known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction. And it was a way to justify building nuclear weapons while still aiming for peace. And the general idea is that every nation should be afraid to fire a nuclear weapon, because if they do, other nations are going to fire nuclear weapons at them, and essentially we're going to kill the whole planet. So if you are the one that sends the nuclear weapon, you're basically assuring that the planet's going to be destroyed. And that idea is supposed to keep a nation from not doing it. And so far, it kind of happened. I mean, there's lots of other things that have taken place, but it's kind of true. We're still here today. which means that none of the huge world-destroying kind of nuclear wars happened. But it was close for a while. The period of time called the Cold War was called the Cold War because the potential for for world-ending war was there, but it never really happened. So the potential was there, but it didn't happen. So it's Cold War, so as in cold as it's frozen, things didn't happen. And but it was very, very frightening in the States at the time. In the late 50s, early 60s, Russia had found somebody in Cuba, Fidel Castro, who was a revolutionary who, with his group, had taken over from a guy named Batista, was the leader in Cuba. And Batista was one of those, U.S. puppets that I talked about. He, things in Cuba were kind of done with money and stuff from the U.S. There was a lot of mafia involvement in building casinos and resorts and things in Cuba. And so that government was more or less a puppet government of the U.S. And then Fidel Castro, who had very communist ideas and worked with the Russians, managed to take over. So we had this. Cuba's only 90 miles from Florida, by the way, in the States. That's not very far. You can get across it in a motorboat pretty easily. So the Russians had worked with Fidel Castro and were building nuclear weapons and shipping nuclear weapons to Cuba. So now Americans are terrified because there are nuclear weapons from Russia sitting 90 miles off their doorstep in Florida. And essentially from there, they could get to any major city with a major nuclear weapon very easily. So the U.S. has to prevent this. So this is the kind of like the tensest moments of the Cold War. Everybody in Florida and the southern United States are building bomb shelters and doing bomb raids. Like, this is what happens. You should duck and cover. Wouldn't have done any good, but generally just to kind of give people a plan and make them feel better. But the U.S. has to do something about that. So it's basically Kennedy in the U.S. and a combination of Fidel Castro in Cuba and Nikita Khrushchev, who was the essentially president of Russia at the time. I can't remember the term, prime minister maybe. It was those two against Kennedy, and things got really, really tense. And Kennedy basically said, "You get your stuff out of Cuba, or we are going to attack you." And so Khrushchev essentially had a decision: are they going to leave the nuclear weapons and the military might in Cuba, or are they going to back off to Russia? And the general idea, or the general consensus, not consensus, the gist or the opinion, general opinion in history is that Khrushchev blinked. So, Khrushchev was, not bluffing, but he wasn't willing to go to those lengths, and he wasn't willing to risk nuclear war. So he backed off and brought stuff back to Russia. So it was a big prideful moment for the U.S. And then, of course, Kennedy got killed in '63 and whatnot and sent things into upheaval again. But that was the Cold War, because it never really happened. And this is war all the way up into the 80s until there was a more democratic approach taken in Russia with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was sort of the last, what you would think of, before in the last communist leader of Russia. Then things kind of settled down, and we considered the Cold War kind of over. But it was a long period of time where the U.S. and Russia just had a bunch of nuclear missiles, and the opportunity to use them, and nobody did, and that's a really good thing, because it could have ended the world essentially. So we're into the 60s now. Anti-war sentiment. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the fear that was involved in that, people are really starting. People, in society, normal people, are really starting to, be a bit more vocal about anti-war opinions. Like, we can't do this anymore, and it bred a whole generation of people in the 60s who were very, very anti-war during a time where things were starting to get unsettled in not Europe but Southeast Asia again. And we're talking about the Vietnam War. So at home here, at least, the idea that sort of normal people can start a movement and start protests and and actually get to a point where their goals are met is something that people are more comfortable doing. They're not as worried in general about starving to death or not having a house or whatnot. Those needs are mostly met, particularly in North America. So they're comfortable to the point where they can advance some of these social causes, and some of the major social causes in the U.S. that needed addressing at the time. And we're talking, sort of, let's say 40s to late 60s here. In particular, the Jim Crow laws and the advancement of African American people in the United States. You've probably, hopefully you're just kind of aware, just as a human being, that there used to be, slavery in the U.S. for a long time, hundreds of years ago, but that attitudes toward Black people, African Americans, were still very, very racist in certain parts of the U.S., particularly in the southern areas. And there was segregation, and whites could do this, and what they referred to as colored people. Like this is a white swimming pool. Colored people can't be in the white swimming pool. This is a drinking fountain for whites only. You couldn't go into certain restaurants, or you had one side of the restaurant. You had to sit at the back of the bus. All of these things just shouldn't have been happening at that point in time, but people just, they were so stubborn and so unwilling to admit that we're all just people in certain areas, and that largely in the south of the United States was sort of the prevailing opinion, and it was supported by government, it was supported by laws, it was whatnot. It was things were segregated, and there was a big social movement in the United States in the early 60s. I mean, it started before that, but in the early to late 60s, for the rights of African American people and equality and the advancement of the rights and liberties of African American people in general. So that was a huge movement in the United States and in Canada. I like to think, maybe I'm being a bit ethnocentric, but I like to think that we were a bit more enlightened about these things in Canada at the time. We didn't have as much segregation or whatnot. But then again, you absolutely cannot discount the position and views toward Indigenous people at the same time. With it's a bit hypocritical actually for me to say that, because we kind of pretended that we were so enlightened about African American people and people of color, but at the same time we're still committing atrocities essentially against Indigenous people. So I certainly do recognize that. But in the States, at that time, there was a big movement for the emancipation of, well, not emancipation is release from slavery, but for the advancements of rights and liberties of African American people, particularly in the American South. So that was a huge moment, period of time, very important. Black people, white people working together to try to get the rights and liberties that everybody deserves. And you probably have heard of some of the main figures there. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and ideas like that. So that's something that's huge in the United States through the 60s, as well as the anti-war movement would be sort of the other big one. We're tired of war. We don't like the draft. We don't like the idea of anybody can be told by their country to go overseas to fight a war. And that came to a head with the Vietnam War, which was essentially early 60s to early mid 70s, where it was another one of those communist versus democracy ideas. The Republic of South Korea was essentially democratic. North Korea was, I forgot that backwards. Oh man, that's kind of a bad thing to get backwards. But North Korea was in danger, I would say. Maybe not dangerous, not the right word, but they were. Did I say Korea? I meant Vietnam. Pretty sure the North was. See, when you forget things like this, you just go. You go to Google and make sure that you're right. Can't believe I got it confused here. Yes, okay, I had it right. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union, was essentially North Vietnam was supported by Russia. So potential for communism taking hold in North Korea or North Vietnam. Stop saying Korea. In North Vietnam, U.S. comes to support South Vietnam in taking over and flushing out the communists and making sure that democracy reigns and whatnot. And essentially, it was a terrible war for the United States. They drafted people, which means basically a lottery. If you were of a certain age and life station, you would just get drafted into the army, and you would be forced to go train on Parris Island and then head over to Vietnam. And we were fighting a war in Vietnam that Americans had no experience with. It was jungle war. It wasn't the kind of war that they'd fought in World War II, World War I. It wasn't like fighting in the independence era. This was jungle warfare, something the U.S. had no experience with and was not good at. And the military might that the U.S. had and the weaponry and whatnot kind of it was good in the beginning and it was working in the beginning. But the longer the war went on, the better the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were at exploiting the weaknesses of the U.S. and with the support of Russia. I don't know if they ever declared a winner in the war. I don't think anybody won, but the U.S. definitely did not win that war. And look, hundreds of thousands of Americans killed overseas, a lot of them fighting in a war that they didn't really feel all that strongly about. People in America and Canada felt very, very strongly about Hitler and the Holocaust and things like that, and that Germany and Italy, they needed to be stopped. They didn't feel that way about Vietnam in general. And so you have a lot of people that are fighting a war in a place that they don't understand for a cause that they're not really all that much in support of, and fighting in a way that you've never fought before, jungle warfare, real guerrilla warfare type stuff, led to kind of horrific results for the United States. And back home, it really strengthened the anti-war movement. You might have heard of them as hippies and, make love, not war, and Woodstock and all that kind of stuff. The primary message there was peace, love, and hope, sort of Renaissance ideals, most of them. But the idea was that the longer that war went on, the stronger that anti-war movement became. So that was a very important time in the United States, and an important I don't know, milestone is not the right word, but it's an important time, a time that shaped a lot of what you see in the U.S. today. And a lot of those people are still alive. There's hardly anybody left from World War II. My grandfather's gone. My grandmother is still alive, but most of the World War II vets are they're in their 90s. They're passing on. That there's not as much direct history that we can access right now, but the Vietnam era, the 60s, the 70s, and the Cold War through that whole period into the 80s, that's something that the majority of people are still alive. The people my father's age and younger, and so that's something that's still very important. Might not be the right word, but there's still enough people alive that influence from that era holds to today, and so these were really, really important periods in American history. And if you're of my father's age, the sort of one defining horrible tragedy that you remember, the thing where you remember exactly where you were when you heard the news, was the Kennedy assassination in 1963. Ask anybody who's 65 to 75 years old and ask them what's the thing that sticks in your mind where I absolutely know where I was and where I heard it. Most of them will tell you the Kennedy assassination. For my generation, I would say it's probably 9/11. Everybody in my generation will remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard about the planes hitting the towers. For your generation, I'm not sure. It might be COVID, and that's not sort of a thing where you can say, I remember hearing about it this and this time, but it might be the thing that you remember when you're 45 years old going, oh man, yeah, I remember COVID. That was the thing that was happening in the world during my formative years. In any case, those people are still alive, so a lot of the sentiments and a lot of the memories from the protests of those days are still around and are recognized as shaping the United States and Canada into what they are. Now, eventually, in the USSR or Russia, communism fell. People were it didn't work out the way that Marx wanted it to work out when he wrote his books in the 1800s with Joseph Engels. And it didn't work out that way, and it wasn't successful for anybody except for the multi-billionaires that ran things at the top of the Russian government or the Soviet government at the time. And eventually, democracy came to Russia. You can look or read up about democracy and government in Russia, and I would encourage you to do so. I think you would agree that it's probably not as democratic as they pretend it to be, although fair argument could be made the same way in the U.S. Sorry, it's the nature of the world. The people with money and power get what they want. And I really wish it wasn't that way, but I also can't lie to you. So we're talking about social identity and social movements in the 60s, very, very, very important time period for North America. So as you go through those things, again, look at the assignments, kind of pick out some things that you want to look for. You're going to go through the idea of what power is and different types of power, how government power and control of economy and politics is a type of power, but also social unrest and the ability of grassroots movements and people at the lower levels working up the chain to get to fight for things they believe in is also something that is occurring in ways that had never occurred before. Well, definitely prior to the French Revolution, but more recognizably for us in, say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in North America. So a lot of this is about things that I've kind of touched on. The March on Washington was a huge thing in the United States in the 60s. There's Dr. Martin Luther King, unfortunately assassinated by James Earl Ray, I believe, but the figurehead of the American civil rights protests and movement, civil rights movement in the U.S., which was essential for helping to address the inequities that African Americans and people of color faced in the United States. There's similar things going on in Europe. Berlin Wall, okay, something I forgot to mention at the end of World War II. Russia had basically control over half of Germany, and Germany was split into like 4 territories. U.S. had one, Britain had one, Russia had one, and France maybe had the other. Eventually, it kind of came down to half of Germany was Russian controlled, and the other half was sort of Britain/America controlled. And there was communism on one side, and there was democracy on the other. And they literally built a wall through the middle of Berlin, separating East and West Germany. And that was well into my lifetime. I don't think the Berlin Wall came down until the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, there it was, 1989, big assembly. So when the Berlin Wall came down, and sort of the democracy takes hold again, and everybody's happy and whatnot. That was a big moment that I remember from. I was young, but I remember it. Women's rights movements, women's lib, feminism, advancement of the freedoms, liberties, and rights of women was very, very important in the 60s and 70s. Women, tended to make less money than men for doing the same job, and there were all sorts of pressures and limitations for women that there shouldn't have been. So very, very important movements there. And again, things that people my parents' age were likely involved in one way or another, or at least alive and paying attention to. So talk to your grandparents more. You'd be amazed at how much information they have. Sexual liberation, the rights of LGBTQ people, and these are important things. I'm not going through everything. Oh, save the environmental movement to save the planet, no nukes and save the planet, stop burning rainforests and things like that. All very important sort of paving stones for what we see now. I don't want to go into Indigenous movements right now because I think that deserves sort of its own section. And so I'll sign off for today, but thank you again for your time and attention. And as always, I'm available to do my best to help and support you as we get down to the last couple of weeks of the semester. So thanks for listening, and have a wonderful day.